Hello, this is Maya West of Moxie Lab, and today I'm going to be covering the last and most exciting of all the 6 most common obstacles and barriers to your leadership path. And in past videos, I've gone into great depth on the other 5, plus there's a video you'll find that has a summary of 1 through 6. Feel free to check out those videos, but today is by far my favorite, and today is on ancestral narratives of struggle. And I probably feel the most like Alice and Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit tunnel on this one, because it is the most interesting but also bizarre area of inquiry that has really informed our work at Moxie Lab, and yet it's, I think, the most impactful in terms of how we go forward in our own paths but also in our communities. So what do I mean by ancestral narrative struggle? Let me break it down. Ancestral is our ancestors. What happened in the lives of those in our family that came before us, both their joys and their traumas. This is important. The next word, narrative. There's a story that goes along with that. You know, you probably do this in your own family. You like pick the pieces of the story that you think are the most glamorous or the most exciting. You're at the cocktail party and you're like, well, my last name means this and this means this. And my grandmother, came on a boat from here or whatever. And we decide to pick and choose. But there's both the joys of our grandparents and the many generations before, and also the traumas that come along with that. And those are less fun to talk about at cocktail parties. Like, my family are survivors of the genocide. That doesn't stops the conversation usually. But why am I obsessed with this? Well, we know Darwin and his theory of evolution. And for those of you who don't, then you better get out a book while you can and open up the curriculum to what evolution is. But in general, the idea is survival of the fittest. But what we're learning is from this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamerick, and I'm probably massacring that name too, because I've never heard anyone say his name because I've only read about this. But his theory is around this concept of epigenetics. Epigenetics theory is that our environment, things that we experience, other people, plants and animals, chemicals, things that our body gets exposed to in our mind, the joys and the traumas that we get exposed to actually change our genetic structure, which is pretty incredible. And then it's inherited by our children. Why is that so exciting? There's a lot of areas of epigenetics, and I don't know any of them. I'm not a scientist. But what I am obsessed with is this idea of epigenetics, transgenerational inheritance. And you'll find a link on my website about that. There's a post on epigenetics, and it has the link to this particular article. This idea that we inherit the joys and traumas of our ancestors. I am fascinated by this because in my personal life, I've had this very interesting thing that I have been challenged by. I've lived a lot of different class levels, and I've certainly had moments of hunger, but most of my life I've had abundance. Abundance, relatively speaking, to the rest of the world, right? Like predictable meals, good job, shelter, free of mental and physical violence. Pretty lucky that way. But with that said, I had this inexplicable fear of not having enough food. So weird, very weird. Like therapists scratching their head, kind of weird. Like, what is this about? And I just kept feeling like this is not about me. And when I came across this area of research, I was like, yeah, this isn't about me, this is about my ancestors. One of my family's lineages are from Latvia, and during World War II, the Russians liberated our country, and a big number of Latvians were killed, like genocide. My family was lucky and got out and ended up in sunny California, and thank God. But my mom was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany as a result, and spent her first months of life there, and her siblings were born in Latvia in the middle of this war, and my grandparents, had to be in that conflict, and then it goes back in time, right? And so why I share that story is because what they're learning is how this applies to other groups of people. There's been some interesting studies on Holocaust survivors, children and grandchildren. I think that there's becoming some research on African Americans and the history of slavery, and I'm sure it's happening because, of course, that's going to be an area of inquiry. But there's a lot of places where this information is going to be helpful to us. It's also being used from an environmentalist perspective, which is looking at how environmental contaminants impact species in general, and how many generations does that impact go. Why is this an obstacle or a barrier to our leadership path? Is because when we come to the table and make a decision about our future, we're making it from our own childhood trauma experience or not, our own family narrative about what we're supposed to do in this lifetime, but we're also making that decision in the context of a thread and a story of joy and trauma that goes back many generations. You know, when I share this, I mean, almost everybody I tell this to, I'm like, it's so exciting, it's a new research. And they're like, yeah, it's like we know in our core that there's some part of that that feels really true. And in terms of how we use this in our ability to be effective as leaders, is that we have to have compassion, understanding that the person that we're speaking to, this person that we're in conflict with, the person that we're trying to lead, the person that we're trying to follow, comes to the table not just with their story, but their ancestors' story. And so as we work towards a shared humanity or a shared understanding of each other, that we all are coming not just with our own lives, but with the lives before us, the acts both good and bad, and that we have to honor that story. And so one way that we talked about all these barriers and obstacles also being tools, well, obviously, know thy ancestors, know your people, learn more, talk to your family, do some research, try to understand what happened in your family's life, and where were there those moments of joys and where were those moments of struggle. And what the biggest obstacle is when there is a strong narrative of struggle, or there's been more kind of trauma in that lineage than not, then it's harder for us to break out of that and think about our lives in terms of thriving. We just think about our lives in terms of surviving. And that's very legitimate perspective, but if we can look at whether that narrative, that story about our people works for us in our own future, sometimes it helps inform what inflames our passions or what makes us feel courage or motivated to right a wrong or to take a certain step in our lives. It's great for that because struggle is powerful stuff, but struggle doesn't always necessarily help us thrive. So working from survival to thriving is part of what's really cool about learning our family's history, is that we get a chance to create more joy in our genetic experience on this planet, our generational experience, that we get to pass that on to future generations. Even in these times that we're in of great atrocity and great uncertainty and very ego-driven, hyper-masculine, hyper-intense kind of experience right now, what we get to do in the middle of that is still decide what narrative we want, and it gives us the strength and the clarity to help us in how we respond to current events and current challenges in our life. And I think it's a great time to exercise this idea, because now more than ever, we're being asked to try to put a counterweight out to the world of the yuckiness that's happening and to decide what we want to share with future generations, both in our stories and what we do, but also in what our genes say we did when they get passed on to the next generation. And that is why number 6 is the most exciting, because we actually, through our decisions in our life, we can actually change our genetic structure. I really think that that's kind of outrageous, and maybe someone will say, Maya, you have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm going to hold on to that one and, do your own research, of course. Nothing I say here is like 100% proven by anybody, and it probably never will be, but make your own conclusions about what sounds right for you. And so as we wrap up this one, think about the different barriers that we've talked about: the wrong advocates, reacting or resisting change, a challenging or traumatic childhood or adulthood, conflict avoidance, debt or other financial limitations, and then of course ancestral or family narrative of struggle. And ask yourself which one seems like the biggest one for you. And then know that that obstacle is also your coolest tool. It's your best tool, your personal, unique leadership path. And that one will help guide you the most, because it's the hardest one. It's probably the one that's the most worth pursuing. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this video and to be with me today. And please feel free to check out my website and Moxie Lab. And like I said before, I have a blog post on epigenetics there, in this kind of new and exciting emerging field of science. And you can also find out more about who we are and what events we do, etc. And stay tuned for more in the future. Thanks so much for spending time with me today.